2013 season was an exciting one for the Philadelphia Eagles and it ended in a similar fashion. Chip Kelly and Nick Foles burst into the playoffs with their explosive offense and unfortunately crashed out in a loss to the New Orleans Saints. But we won't talk about that bit just for PTSD purposes. But the offseason that followed had to be a big one. There was so much resting on this. It was the first real building block for Chip Kelly and Howie Roseman. How would they build this team? How would they build upon the foundations laid in 2013 with an offense that's more explosive than ever, a team that's ready and raring to make the playoffs? Can they turn this team into a franchise that can sustain success once again? My name is Liam Jenkins and this is another episode of Where Are They Now as we dive back into the 2014 Eagles draft class. But before we get underway, I did just want to say two things. Firstly, a massive thank you to anyone who watched the last video. I really didn't think it would get the support it did. So if you like what we do around here, if you are a fan of that kind of content, make sure you're smashing that like button and hitting subscribe. We want to build the biggest Eagles community on YouTube and we need your help to do it. And secondly, an apology for why there was no video last week. Essentially, I had a short vacation, which never ever happens, and on the last day of it, I fell sick, which meant I was unable to record another video. So unfortunately, I was sat in bed just trying to write out articles instead. So if you want to follow along with everything myself and the other 20 plus writers at Philly Sports Network are getting up to, phillysportsnetwork.com is the place to go, and my Twitter is @LiamJenkins21. The first pick of that 2014 draft class was, of course, The first pick of that 2014 draft class was, of course, Marcus Smith. But before we get into the pick itself, we need to understand the reasoning. Now, this pick, even the moment it happened, was absolutely slated by analysts, by fans, and by just about anyone who knew anything about football, because it just didn't make sense and most didn't see Smith as a first-round talent. However, Chip Kelly was very quick to reassure everyone that it wasn't about seeing people as talented, it was about seeing them as schematic fits. Here's a quote from CSNphilly.com. "You don't know how it's going to pan out. Just going through the analytics of it, 50% of first round picks don't make it. That's through the history of time. When you draft someone in the 6th round and you say, hey, we got a steal, my first question is, well, why didn't you take him in the 5th then? If you're so smart and you knew what you knew and you knew everything about the draft and you knew the guy was going to be an all-pro, the people who brag about, well, we got a 6th round pick and he became an all-pro player, the first question is, why didn't you draft him earlier if you were so smart? A lot of the times, you don't know. Chip Kelly wasn't drafting players because they're talented or because they were the best overall player available. He was drafting them for their athletic traits that fit his system, that elevated his offense, that fit the pieces of the jigsaw he was trying to complete. And that's where we dive in straight away to Marcus Smith. It was a tough few years in Philadelphia for the Louisville product. After being drafted in the 1st round, he was immediately met with the pressure of system changes, low snap counts, a lack of consistency, and of course the dreaded bust label. After a rookie flatline, he had just 7 tackles and a sack 1 year later in 2015. That single sack against the Giants came in week 17, which wasn't exactly the best place to do it. And after a rookie season where he failed to get any kind of metric in 8 games, having played 72 snaps that year, people really started to question what would happen next. In his 3 years with the Eagles, Smith appeared in 37 games and failed to amass a single start. But in his final year with the team, under Jim Schwartz, potential was flashed. He had 3 sacks in his final year, and although it wasn't the most miraculous outing, it wasn't the finest statistical season ever, Marcus Smith flashed that potential, that ability to get off his blocks, to shed the tackles, and to really get into the backfield with some haste. Ultimately, this had to be a big off-season for Marcus Smith. Entering a 2nd season with the same defensive coordinator that had wrung the best out of him like a flannel, he had to shine. There was plenty of new talent at the position, several new faces looking to take his spot, and he had a reputation to try and turn around. So what did the former 1st round pick do? Did he meet it head on with a chip on his shoulder? Not quite. Instead, he missed OTAs until it was mandatory to attend, and that may well have been the nail in the coffin that sent him packing out of the Novacare complex. The Eagles cut Marcus Smith in 2017 and he signed a 1-year deal in Seattle and actually played quite well. He amassed a career-high 2.5 sacks and 14 tackles, forcing his first fumble, but then, despite being one-upped and getting another extension on that under Pete Carroll, he was cut again after missing 2 practices. Now, Pete Carroll was very hush-hush with this. He said it was a personal issue and it was best for both parties to part ways. So, as of right now, Marcus Smith sits on the Washington Redskins roster, perhaps looking to kind of get a career resurgence with those guys. He was signed with them in December this year, after Casanova McKinsey suffered a torn pectoral. The one thing I can safely take away from his time in Philadelphia is that his character didn't match the athletic skill set. And the thing is with Smith that he always had a problem finishing plays. And from the people I've spoken to within the locker room or around the team and beat writers and such, they said that he never felt like a guy that was fully involved. He wasn't an all-in, 100% high motor guy. He was a prospect that had all the tools but just really didn't know how to use them. And to me, heartbreakingly, quantifies the word bust. But we're going to go from bust to best right now, as in the second round, the Eagles selected Jordan Matthews out of Vanderbilt, and this was easily the biggest hit of the draft. Matthews rapidly became a fan favourite and remains as such despite a rollercoaster few years. In fact, prior to being shockingly traded to the Buffalo Bills, Matthews had totaled the most yards of any slot receiver since he entered the league in 2014. The 6'3", 212-pound wideout wasn't just instrumental in the rise of Carson Wentz, but his impact stretched way back into the depths of the Chip Kelly era, where he put up 8 touchdowns in both of those final seasons. In his rookie year of a franchise quarterback, Matthews really worked to build a rapport with Carson Wentz that went beyond football, to a point where the wideout was actually given one of Carson Wentz's dog's puppies, and he spoke about that in an interview with me over at phillysportsnetwork.com. I was lucky to talk with Matthews twice during his first stint with the Eagles, and links to both of those interviews are down in the description below. But during that season alone, he scored 3 touchdowns to go with 804 yards. And given that Matthews was the oldest receiver on the roster, and he was the only real playmaker alongside Zach Ertz, they aren't exactly numbers to shy away from. But then 1 year later, as things were really kicking on and Wentz had built that rapport with Matthews, the two had met at OTAs a week early in the years prior to get that rapport built up, he was traded to the Buffalo Bills. The Eagles needed a cornerback, and they assumed that they could just shift Aguilar inside and get a similar amount of production after he decimated the slot at USC. Now, the trade ultimately worked out, but for Matthews, it didn't go without setbacks, which shockingly, I know, came from the Eagles' medical staff. A pair of bad diagnoses caused him significant setbacks and very almost messed up his knee for good, but the Buffalo doctor sorted him out. Matthews kept his head high, and after a bit of a down year as a result, he ended up in New England of all places. During his off-season with the Patriots, Jordan Matthews was again haunted by injury, picking up an injured hamstring. The Patriots wanted to keep Matthews around, and as a result, put him on injured reserve, hoping they can claim him back in a couple weeks' time. Eagles had other ideas though, and they were in desperate need of some wide receiver production and poached him before the Patriots had a chance. And after getting his feet wet in week 3, Matthews caught an 80-yard bomb in week 4 against the Titans and ran it for a touchdown, his first of the season. And as the offense continued to struggle to find its identity, Matthews' role became clouded. Was he going to play inside? Was he going to play outside? Let's not mention Golden Tate. We soon got our answer though, and most prominently in week 8, he dominated the Jacksonville Jaguars with 93 receiving yards and followed it up with 77 yards combined in his next 2 games on just 6 receptions. He averaged a career high 15 yards per reception, had a pair of touchdowns and caught 20 of 28 targets for 300 yards. Now, is a return likely? Absolutely. Golden Tate could be looking at an expensive deal. Nelson Aguilar carries a $9 million cap hit. Do not be surprised if Jordan Matthews comes back again as a cheap option that he's getting production and has tremendous chemistry with the future franchise quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles. I personally have got so much time for Jordan Matthews. He was one of the first people to give me an interview when I first started Philly Sports Network, and it's not just about the player, it's about the person. Matthews was easily the home run of this draft, and as of right now, he is the only player still on the team. That could have been different if not for the adventures, or misadventures I should say, of Oregon's Josh Huff. Now, I know the Oregon to Chip Kelly connection was absolutely detested by fans everywhere, but the drafting of Josh Huff kind of made sense. He spent most of his time in Philadelphia as an esteemed kick returner and a gadget player who slowly but surely began to work his way onto the field. With 415 return yards, including a 107-yard touchdown in his rookie year, Huff would go on to catch 3 tutties from Sam Bradford in 2015, putting a further 312 yards to his name. things really started to look up for the third round pick. But then in 2016, with a coaching change where his skill set was kind of left to be redundant, he had a real opportunity to diversify his game. However, that didn't go to plan. The former Oregon wideout was arrested for a DUI in November and was released by the team very shortly after. Now this is interesting because according to reports, Huff actually had a permit to carry a firearm. That permit was issued by the state of Texas, where he resides, and was actually legible in Pennsylvania. The issue was he got pulled over in New Jersey, so he's either been very silly or been very silly. And of course then there is no reason to be carrying marijuana. So whatever way you look at it, it was a dumbass decision. The entire matter though seriously appears to be an error of judgment on Huff's part, and one that has cost him very much so a career. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers signed him for all of 1 month from the end of November to the end of December, and then he spent the entire 2017 season as a free agent. The New Orleans Saints would later sign the 26-year-old pass catcher to a reserve and futures contract, but during the offseason it was later announced that because of his former actions that he would have to serve a 2-game ban, and when you're competing in training camp at a position that competitive, you're gonna have very limited reps, and if you're gonna have a 2-game suspension, you're all but out of the window. So since then, Josh Huff has not caught on with another team and remains an NFL free agent. Whether he can seek solace in another league, who knows, but as of right now, things aren't looking good for the former Oregon wide receiver. It's a real shame because, let's be honest, if we examine Doug Peterson's offense in 2018, the amount of jet sweeps and optionality they used, someone of Josh Huff's stature could have excelled under Doug Peterson. Not only that, let's not mention the fact that there has been no real kick returning replacement since Huff left the team. But we're going to go from one man who saw his career decline to someone who has done the opposite, and that man is Jaylen Watkins, a cornerback out of Florida. He spent his rookie season turning heads on special teams and notched 30 defensive snaps in that time frame. The issue was he struggled to make an impact. He gave up a 73-yard touchdown against the Bears during that rookie campaign among a handful of other errors, and that didn't sit too well with the coaching staff. He was eventually cut and signed by the Bills one off-season later, where he actually reunited with his brother Sammy Watkins. And believe it or not, this was the first time that the two had competed together. They had different high schools, different colleges, and that year, of course, Sammy Watkins went out to notch 982 yards and 6 touchdowns, blowing up that Bills offense. So it's safe to say that during his time with the Bills, he probably got a little bit more physical than normal, got a bit more tackly than normal, if that's even a word, but he had to refine those fundamentals because of what a physical receiver Sammy Watkins is. So deep into 2015, after Nolan Carroll's impressive campaign was cut short due to an ankle injury, the Eagles had to bring back Jaylen Watkins. They needed cornerback help, and they needed it now. So Watkins was dropped into the deep end and straight away had to face Larry Fitzgerald, Deshaun Jackson, Jordan Reed and John Brown at the end of that campaign. Bearing in mind he had 30 defensive snaps as a rookie, he had 160 snaps after being re-signed after that Thanksgiving loss. And he made the most of them. I remember writing this article on Philly Sports Network and showing the film. Against the Cardinals, for instance, Watkins allowed just 1 completion on 6 Malcolm Floyd targets, and that itself was a stunning 29-yard catch he couldn't do much about. He helped shut down Deshaun Jackson on a vital route that was going for a touchdown, and then came the Chip Kelly roster purge. This was a big year for Jaylen Watkins now because there were 11 defensive backs on the roster, all trying to juggle their way into contention. Did Watkins stay at cornerback, a place of comfort where he was really battling the likes of Ja'Cory Shepherd and names that had just been drafted, or does he take a plunge into a slightly less dense safety position, knowing that he's got to learn a whole new realm of responsibility? In the first 2 preseason games, he took the plunge, amassed 6 tackles, 2 passes defense and an interception, and that was enough. That was enough to convince Jim Schwartz that the vastly underrated third safety could stick onto the roster and hang with the big dogs, and from then on, the rest was history. Combining for 30 tackles and 3 passes defense in 2016, it was the next campaign that mattered most. Jaylen Watkins was an integral wheel on that back line of defense, while Malcolm Jenkins snuck down into linebacker and wreaked havoc as a remote control missile wherever Jim Schwartz wanted. After that, as we all know, he went on to sign with the LA Chargers and heartbreakingly tore his ACL. It was a 1-year deal. He misses the season and is now a free agent once more. But Jaylen Watkins saved his career by gambling on himself, racing that inner versatility, the willingness to adapt, Some players wouldn't have done it. Some players would have stayed at cornerback, but the fact that Watkins, when he came into the league, was giving up big touchdowns, was an awful tackler, I'm sure he won't mind me saying, wasn't very strong in that area, and came back, moved to safety, and was wrapping up ball carriers with confidence, was still aggressive at the point of the catch. It was such a big improvement, and you can only be happy for Watkins having landed in LA. Now, let's be honest, the Eagles need safety help. There's a very good chance that Watkins will return, given that Corey Graham is likely to retire, and Rodney McLeod could very well become a cap casualty. They need safety depth, and Jaylen Watkins may just be the man to come in and sneak the job. In the 5th round, however, the Eagles selected Taylor Hart out of, you guessed it, Oregon. And Hart's story is very interesting. He joined the team as a defensive tackle who could play defensive end, but spent the majority of his opening few years in the league sat on the sidelines, competing at training camp, and ending up in practice squads. The ceiling was fairly limited, and after a brief stint with the San Francisco 49ers, he decided to make a monumental gamble. The defensive tackle switched sides and started playing offensive tackle prior to last season's off-season workout program. Now that caught a lot of people off guard. This was a man that had spent 3 or 4 years in the NFL by this point on the defensive side of the football, and Eagles coaches were that impressed with that willingness to change, that drive, that determination to stick onto a roster, that they brought him back for the off-season. Unfortunately, Taylor Hart was cut during those final tricky decisions, and he hasn't really been able to recover from that one since. So he's still an experienced option at offensive tackle. He's been in the league a little while now. He's floated around several practice squads, bounced on and off the Eagles for countless occasions since joining the team in 2014. As of right now, he's a free agent, but he's a very notable one because he's someone the Eagles could just sneak and plug in at any time as a backup emergency tackle. We saw it in the preseason. He's got a lot of tape to his name at this point. Don't be surprised if Taylor Hart's name does pop up on some other rosters in years to come. It's a fascinating story, and one that just shows the lengths that players will go to get their jobs in the NFL. We see quarterbacks to wide receiver a lot. A change of heart in the trenches, though, if you will, is far less common, so it's always going to be intriguing to see where Taylor Hart ends up next. With the team's 2nd, 5th round pick that year, they drafted Ed Reynolds, a safety out of Stanford. And this is another name that always comes up because he's a talented safety that has again been hampered by injury. During his time with the Eagles, he played in 6 games, and most notably, I'm sure most of you will remember, picked off a Tyrod Taylor pass to seal an Eagles win back in 2015. However, he never really saw the field a lot, and the problem was that there was a lot of depth at the position, and that with injuries and stuff like that, he only ever really got his opportunities at the misfortunes of others, and when he did, he very rarely made the most of them. In preseason and training camp, he was always a menace, but he couldn't really get on the field past that. So the Eagles cut him the next offseason in their final roster cuts, and he ended up with the Cleveland Browns on their practice squad. Now this got very interesting because all of a sudden the Browns started to notice that Ed Reynolds does play with a chip on his shoulder. Maybe the Eagles cutting him sort of helped that, and rapidly stuck him into a live game situation. Not only that, but he went on to appear in 10 games and start 7 of them for the Cleveland Browns. He recorded 30 tackles and a sack, and just really gave the Browns a sudden sense of serenity at the position. It was really strange, but just warming to see Ed Reynolds go from someone cutting his teeth and grinding and clawing for any scrap of opportunity in Philadelphia to bounce onto the Browns practice squad. They see the mentality they like and they elevate him to the next position. However, the offseason that followed was a haunting one, and a sprained MCL just on the eve of training camp. Ed Reynolds was out for the count, it seemed, in that scenario. The Browns waived him a couple of days later, and even though the injury wasn't that serious, it could have been obviously very easily healed. It wasn't a torn ACL or anything like that. The Browns didn't want to run the risk, and Reynolds hasn't been with the team since, and that is such a shame. Reynolds has been a real high character guy. He was a stand-up character inside the locker room. A lot of defensive players liked his aggression, and you could see it with the Browns. To go from the practice squad to a suddenly starting safety, that is not an easy thing to do, even if it's on the Browns at that time. So Ed Reynolds has a lot of potential. I'm really rooting for him. I hope he can get his feet back into the NFL soon. Maybe it's in the CFL, maybe it's in the AAF or the XFL or whatever other 3-letter combination you want to make now for an emerging football league. But Reynolds has the skill set. Hopefully the injuries are left behind him when he gets into his new position. And finally, the last draft pick of that year was, of course, Beau Allen out of Wisconsin, and this man was another fan favourite. The Eagles saved arguably the best for last in terms of hair, at least, Goldilocks himself was a crucial cog in the Eagles Super Bowl run. He spent 4 years with Philadelphia, started 8 games, but played in 63, and that's a lot for a 7th round pick, not just to be on the roster that long, but to play in that many games. Especially under Jim Schwartz, Beau Allen came alive. He was never really a statistical standout, but what he did offer was a lot of momentum. He played 40% of snaps during the team's Super Bowl run and was absolutely vital in keeping Fletcher Cox fresh, Timmy Jernigan raring to go, and clogging those running lanes. He was a true nose tackle. He refined his skill set over time, and after the Super Bowl ceremony, he earned himself a 3-year, $15 million contract with the Buccaneers, which was a very happy day for himself, but a little bit sad as well. We all saw the emotional message he posted on Instagram. The wild card here, though, is that the Bucs actually have an out at the end of this year, similar to what the Eagles have with Nick Foles. And with Todd Bowles now switching to a 3-4 defense, one has to wonder whether or not Beau Allen, who posted relatively similar stats to what he did with the Eagles, would be worth taking a $5 million cap hit for. If he isn't, there is every chance that Beau Allen returns to the team that drafted him and helps complete the fairy tale. He was such a fan favourite. He was always a stand-up guy in and around the locker room. You can ask anyone on the team or media. Beau Allen was loved. He was always the joker. And who knows, he may well have one last chapter as a Philadelphia Eagle. Now, of course, there were some notable free agents as well. Trey Burton was arguably the most prominent, who went on to record the most iconic play of all time in Super Bowl 52 before moving over to Chicago. But overall, this class wasn't great. Let's be honest here, there's one player that's currently on this team, and even that was in an exceptional circumstance. Marcus Smith was a bust. Jordan Matthews back with the team as of right now. Josh Huff out of the league. Jaylen Watkins ACL torn but with the LA Chargers as of right now. Taylor Hart currently out of the league. Ed Reynolds out of the league. Beau Allen could be coming home. But in a year that was so crucial to this Eagles team to build on that success late in 2013, they stepped up to the plate with bases loaded and they struck out. It was absolutely abysmal. It's great there have been some high points like Jordan Matthews and Beau Allen, but for the most part, they needed a wholesome draft. They needed to tick those boxes and they ended up with crosses. It was such a shame, and it was arguably when the wheels started to come off the wagon here in the Chip Kelly era. Let me know what sort of classes you want me to recap, guys. Maybe it's an older one, maybe a slightly newer one. But if you like what we do here at Philly Sports Network, hit that like button and smash that subscribe button as well. From myself, Liam Jenkins, thank you so much for taking the time to tune into this video. You can follow me at LiamJenkins21 on Twitter. And don't forget, you can check out all of mine and our writers' content at phillysportsnetwork.com.